Hi, everybody, and welcome to the IaC Podcast. My name is Ohad Meislish. I will be the host for today. You can follow me on Twitter at DevOpsOhad. And today we're going to have an amazing guest, Andrew Brown. Welcome, Andrew.
Hey, Ohad, thanks for having me on the podcast today. I'm really excited here to talk about IaC.
Thank you, Andrew. For those who don't know Andrew, you need to follow him. I think he has about 30,000 Twitter followers already or something like that. So obviously he's a very interesting uh, person to talk about IaC today. Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Oh, sure. So, for those who don't know, I create a lot of different kinds of content in the cloud. So, AWS courses, Azure, GCP, Terraform, Kubernetes, you name it. I'm creating courses for it. I've been in the ed tech business for a long time. My background is building out learning platforms, and I have a strong interest in helping folks learn tech education. I'm in a part of my career where I can just kind of do whatever I want. And so my goal really is to, build out a learning platform, help content creators, and just make it easier or learning content for tech education to be a lot more accessible. One interesting thing that I've been up to as of late is running boot camps. I've been running them for free. The last one I had 10,000 registered participants, and we had to cap it there. And so I think the next boot camp that we want to do is Terraform, because I find IaC is really fun, and IaC is obviously a critical component, whether you want to be cloud engineer or DevOps. But yeah, there's lots to talk about. So yeah, hopefully that's a good start to an introduction.
That was perfect, and again, and your background is super impressive. The fact that you have tens of thousands of registration to your content, to your courses, I think says a lot about the quality of the content that you generate. Awesome. Let's talk about IaC and let's talk about Terraform. You mostly mentioned Terraform in your content when it comes to IaC. What do you think about Terraform versus other frameworks such as Pulumi or the vendor-specific, let's say, CloudFormation for AWS? How do you see the ecosystem?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different tools out there for infrastructure as a code. We're looking at things again as Terraform. There's the offshoot of TerraGrunt. We have on the Azure platform or Azure, however you prefer to pronounce it, Azure Bicep, which I'm a really big fan of. I really like their implementation there. Then when you're on AWS, you have CloudFormation, SAM, which is I would describe as a subset or a DSL of CloudFormation for serverless. We have CDK, which is an imperative version of if you don't like writing YAML declarative code, you can do that. Similar to Pulumi. Pulumi is an imperative one. Let's use your favorite programming language, similar to CDK. There's just a lot of stuff out there. Then there's things that are IaC-like. That's configuration management that some people mistake as being IaC, like Ansible, you know, or
Yep.
or there's the really old school people that they don't trust any of this stuff, so they write everything as bash scripts with their CLI commands. But there's clearly a landscape of tools that you can use,
And
and the
Python.
and Python, yeah, Python. Right now, Python's like the number one language. Everybody wants to learn it. But there's a lot of stuff out there, and these are all different tools in your tool belt, and the right tool for the job is conditional based on the requirements, your team, and other things. So personally, if I'm building a project on AWS and I'm only using AWS resources, I don't plan to use anything else, I'll use CloudFormation. Uh, Also, it also depends on the size of the team and their domain knowledge. So if I have a team and they're all really good at, they're not great at, they're not DevOps, but they're all developer backgrounds, like that kind of thing, then they're going to be more comfortable with CDK because they can use Python or TypeScript. Um, or also, you have to think about maintaining that code. Are you going to have people in there actively updating that code on a regular basis? Because if you use CloudFormation, it's just YAML templates. I have CloudFormation templates that are very old, years and years old, but I can open them up and I don't have to do any updating or upgrading with them. And so there's a lot of factors. So I'm using all of them based on the scenarios. Not to talk too much about boot camps, but we just did our AWS boot camp, and we used SAM, we used CloudFormation, we used CDK, and people were begging me to use Terraform. And if I had a little extra time, we would have used it. And so, it's just it's emergent based on the use case.
That's great, and funny that you mentioned CDK twice in the last couple of minutes, because on our next episode of the podcast, we're gonna have as a guest the founder, the creator of CDK. So that's a shout out to our next episode. And it's also interesting that you mentioned Bicep of Azure. Not many people heard of Bicep. I think more heard of ARM templates, which is the first native Azure IaC framework that Azure created, and Bicep is more HCL style and more similar to Terraform, if I understand correctly. Awesome. You've mentioned Ansible and Bash scripts, and you're working very closely with DevOps engineers that need to evolve to those new technologies. How do you compare the work, the daily work that a DevOps engineer needs to do today compared to 5 or 10 years ago when it comes to writing code and understanding those framework? What has changed in the skills needed, and maybe in the tasks that are assigned to those DevOps engineers from your point of view?
Sure. And just before I go directly answer that, I think I know who your next guest is. And there was one flavor of infrastructure as code that I think is really interesting. And I think that fellow who used to work on CDK is working on this. And it's called infrastructure encode, where you write your code and then it infers what you want for your infrastructure and spins it up, which is a cool one. Infrastructure encode. One of the projects out there is called Winglang. So folks, if you've never heard of it, you should go check it out. But I would say
you totally outed the next guest. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, that's okay. Hey, I didn't say the name, but they have to go. They have to go do their homework and find out. But I think it's an exciting project. I have very large interest in it. But I would say that when we talk about what DevOps folks need to know now, it's more of like what are they able to do that they weren't able to do before, because their infrastructure wasn't all API driven before, right? So before, you had to write bash scripts, or you had to use proprietary tools. Like those who managed Windows know what I'm talking about. They'd buy paid ClickOps services, and they could write some scripting language. And these proprietary services would manage the state. State is very important. But there was a transitional period of the old realm of Windows servers and things like that, or CF. What is it called? CF Engine. I always forget what it's called. But it's the oldest like open source IaC tool that you could use to manage your servers. And our infrastructure has gotten a lot more complex, right? It's not just these are compute boxes, but these are specialized compute boxes that are doing specific things, and they're all API driven. And so now we are able to drive everything via an API, and we are now able to manage the state. And that's something that we just weren't able to do very easily, or if it was, again, it was a proprietary service. So I think that's the major change, is that API. So as a DevOps person, you want to take advantage of these of this stuff, and be able to make your infrastructure. I have a hard time saying this word, but I'll try it. It's idempotent. Idempotent, is that the right word? I always have a hard time to say it, but the idea is that if you write a bash script and you run it twice, you don't want it to run twice. You just want it to put the stuff into a very specific state. And so all these modern frameworks is that they make sure that instead of saying do this thing, be in this state. And I think that's the largest outcome to it. And it makes your life a lot easier, because you're not going to have side effects when trying to manage your infrastructure. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you've mentioned the word state 3 times, and I think that's the main difference between something like Terraform and something like Ansible. In Terraform, you have a state file, and that's like part of your part of your state.
Yes, part of your state.
Part of you can have several lines of code, and it executes different things. It can execute nothing. Depends on the state. If you already executed it once and it provisioned and update the cloud resources and updated the state accordingly, then the next execution will be what's called an empty plan. And the fact that you have both code and a state file is the powerful combination in order to manage infrastructure.
Yeah, and yeah, that empty plan or that plan that's going to be executed, we call those change sets, I believe. And so the idea, I think so. Anyways, I always forget all the terminologies, but the point is that
Mhm.
you say, I'm going to change this. Here's the
Yep,
plan to change it. Roll it out, and then here's the thing that says the state that it is. Now you mentioned Ansible. There was other technologies prior as well, like Chef and Puppet.
correct.
And again, these tools did not manage state, but they did make automation in a generalized way with a domain specific language, a DSL, a lot easier to do. And so, some folks are still there. They're either using batch scripts or they're in this middle state where they're using configuration management tools. And then the third step would be infrastructure as a code. And then the fourth step after that would be to, I suppose, do GitOps and do
Yep.
full automation. And so, wherever you are in your journey, the farther you can get to this side of it, the more valuable you are going to be in your career, but also the less work your organization is going to have to do, the easier it's going to be for you to do your day to day stuff. So, at least
Yeah.
that's what I think.
Yeah. Yeah. You've described the maturity journey of both the technology and the skills of a DevOps engineer. It goes hand in hand. And you've talked about GitOps. So yeah, once you have code in GitHub and cloud resources in AWS, you need to manage those two together somehow. And GitOps is the first concept for you to do so. Let's say you merge some code, so you want to execute the new code and to make sure it's aligned with the infrastructure in production or in staging or in several environments that are reflected by the same code. One of the main things we see as the very first challenge to manage code separately from the cloud resources is drift.
Yes.
And detecting a drift early is something, in my point of view, that we see a lot of companies struggle with. What is your point of view about GitOps and drifts and other challenges that companies face today when they try to manage their infrastructure with code such as Terraform?
Sure. I'll answer that. I'm just going to backpedal once more here and just to talk about our DevOps a person there. So DevOps, half of the word there is developer, and
Mm-hmm.
one thing that developers are good at is coding. And so this is a question I hear a lot from people that want to get into DevOps or they want to advance their career in the DevOps. They say, "Do I really need to learn coding?" And I go, "Well,
Yes.
yeah, you do. Especially if
Yes.
you want to. When we look at our maturity journey for IaC, when you're doing GitOps, now you're touching repos. You have to know how to commit to repo, like you have to know how to do Git management and the stuff like that. Or if you want to take advantage, of course, of these other emerging or mature products out there, they're all using programming, right? Even if you're doing configuration management, you still need to know programming, like Chef is. Well, I don't know if it still is, but at one point it was all Ruby based and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. So yeah, coding is definitely part of the journey. The other part of that question there, if I can recall it, because I went on a tangent there for a moment. Um, I know I'm terrible, but uh,
Drift,
drift.
Andrew,
Sorry,
drift.
yes, drift. Thank you, drift. And that's an example of drift. I drifted away
You
from the
drifted away.
conversation,
You drifted away.
and has drift detection on, and he
I
pulled me right back
detected,
there.
yeah.
But a comparison between CloudFormation and Terraform is that CloudFormation has this button that you can press,
Yep.
and it will
Mm-hmm.
tell you have a drift detection. But having drift is one thing, but how do you remediate it? And so one of the frustrating things about CloudFormation is that it will tell you things have drifted, but to get things back into the normal state, it can be kind of janky. Whereas with Terraform, you just do Terraform plan and apply, and then it's going to go ahead and try to put it back into its other states. So that's like one of those trade-offs between those different tools. In terms of, at
I,
least that's sorry.
I
Oh,
have to interrupt you. Yeah, you're
go for it.
right. Technically, you can remediate those drifts by applying the current code. However, I think this is very, very, very dangerous because probably, somebody changed those cloud resources intentionally in order
Hmm.
to do something. And if you just blindly fix the drift by reverting that change, yeah, you won't have a drift anymore, but you might have caused a severe issue in your cloud account when it comes to stability, performance, security, whatever reason somebody changed this thing manually without changing the code. So it's sometimes not a technical question how to remediate the drift. It's more of a process and workflow, and sometimes a business question on what it means to remediate a drift.
Yeah, so I guess the question for CloudFormation, is it a bug or is it a feature that you cannot
Yep.
easily remediate? And that's always an important thing to ask. Terraform does give you the flexibility to do both, right? So you can replace it or say try to bring those resources in. But of course, with great powers come great responsibilities. So you want to be very careful what you're doing. Even when I'm teaching, even like CloudFormation, I will always make sure we go check the change sets, even though if we know what we're doing, because those resources can replace when you don't expect them to be replacing, and then we're running into trouble there. So it's really interesting to see the comparative differences. But yeah, I think drift is something that I think a lot of companies have a hard time with. Another thing with just using IaC in general is trying to have a strategy to plan out and determine the boundaries of your templates. So if you're using CloudFormation, there are particular areas where you have to draw the line in terms of these resources should be part of IaC, and some things actually should never be part of IaC, or some resources have to come before other ones, and so that's going to determine how you split up those files. Because I think a lot of people think that you create one big file, right?
No.
And you push it, and then you have this portable file, and that's not true. You basically have these few files that have to connect in certain ways, and depending on how you couple them together or not couple them, you're going to have pros or cons, and it's not always clear until you do it. Another thing is that when you write IaC, you don't just write it once and it's done. You have to go tear it down, tear it back up, change values, and test the flexibility of those tools, because often you'll find out that you might run into a state where, especially like again, I talk about CloudFormation a lot, but in CloudFormation you can have nested stacks, and so you might find out that you need to pull back a bunch of layers and then fix this one down below here to get back to your problem. And so you really do have to do more than just write it once and then it's done. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely one big file, one big stack is, it's the natural way to think of things when you start. But as you evolve, we often see like the shift from monolith to microservices. We see
Mm-hmm.
the similar concept when it comes to IaC, dividing your infrastructure as code into different modules, different templates, different files, and then you need to have those workflows and dependencies between those different files, which is not an easy task. And the open sources or the frameworks by themselves are not helpful in that. You need somehow to orchestrate, manage those workflows. Uh, this is not an end of zero podcast, but it's as you've mentioned that, yeah, N of Zero, and I'm co-founder and CEO of N of Zero, is trying to solve those challenges among others as well, because those are challenges that you face when you scale your infrastructure as code, and you're no longer just having one workspace, one state file, one file of code. You need somehow to address those workflow um, challenges. And I also want to say, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago the famous Spider-Man phrase that with great power you need to have
Great IaC.
great responsibility.
Sure.
IaC is very powerful, but also very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
You can easily change code, and many developers have access to the code because it sits there in your GitHub repo. And sometimes a small change might not look dangerous, but the impact of applying those changes can be horrible. So you need to have the guardrails, but I think before having the guardrails, you need to have the mindset of understanding what it means to just change some code. It can create stability issues. It can create security issues. It can create cost issues. So you need to be very careful changing, reviewing, applying those changes. That's why there are some, concepts such as OPA and policy as code, or study code analysis such as Chekhov and TFSEC and Terrascan and others that help you catch some disasters early. But any way you look at it, it comes back to the first three letters of the word DevOps, and those are dev and developers. It all comes to code. And I feel that 10 years ago it was all about ClickOps. DevOps engineers did more ops than dev and had to operate the cloud accounts by understanding the different services, the different capabilities that the cloud accounts have. Now they still need to be experts in that, but also be experts in developing code in the frameworks that we've mentioned earlier. Do you see a lot of DevOps engineers that struggle with that mindset change, or do you?
Oh yes, of course, because it's a total different workflow. It's completely different from their prior experience. They've learned these very specific proprietary software tools that automate the work, and they became experts in those. And now we have, again, API driven, many cases open source tools that give you a lot more flexibility, or are more agnostic, and are more powerful, and will give you and give you back a lot more of your times to focus on other things. What was interesting, you were talking about the life cycle of IaC, and for developers that are listening here, that there's a lot of things that we can do before we roll out code to production, like running tests and things like that. It's the same thing for infrastructure, as we heard about OPA, which again it's kind of like tests for your infrastructure in a sense. It's making sure it's governance, right? You're saying, I expect this thing to be this way, and that's something that you can do. Or you could say, make sure that this thing doesn't get deleted or replaced before you roll it out. But the question is how are we able to get to that the end of the maturity journey, to the best version of IaC? And you need a platform. Some of these are built into the platform. So when you look at AWS and Azure, they manage the state of the file, right? So and they have tools, and they're good enough if that's all you're going to use. If you're only going to be on AWS, and it depends on also the size of your organization, because the governance and the management of those workflows are also limited. But it can work based on the size of your organization. If you think that you need to use other stuff, and often people do, because even if you think that you are using just AWS as your primary workload, you might be using the Microsoft ecosystem for the management of your business. You might be storing your data over in GCP. You might be using something outside of the major cloud service providers, like a third-party provider, because as long as there's an API, there can be a Terraform provider, and you can utilize IaC. And so there is a huge draw for everything to be towards Terraform. But again, often, companies, if they're not just using Terraform, they might be using two different types of IaCs, or three different types of IaCs. And so it would be nice if there is one place that you can do everything in one place. And so there are some providers, and again, OHAD's not trying to plug M0, but I'm just saying that that's an example of an automation and configuration platform that does get ops, where you have all these IaCs, and you can use whichever one you want, and you can take advantage of all these automated checks and governance and things that you want. And so I think that folks should, or organizations should be looking at a particular tool that they'll need to use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. One last question before we finish this great session today. Sure. What is your tip for those DevOps engineers that are more familiar with ClickOps and manually operating the cloud, and now need to become more developers and struggle with that? From all your boot camps and all your experience trying to train those DevOps engineers, if you can have one tip to tell to our audience today, what would be your tip?
Oh my goodness! Of course, come out to my boot camps and my courses. That's the most obvious answer, right? But the thing is that one thing that I get asked a lot is like, can you make an advanced Terraform course? And I don't even know what that is. And so what
Mhm.
I'm trying to say here is that that I think that a lot of people think that IaC is a lot more intimidating and goes a lot deeper than you think. But if you start jumping into it, you'll find that in the course of a month or two, you'll have good proficiency of skills, and it won't be so difficult. So instead of doing theory, put it into practice and start implementing things today, and try to build out a relatively complex a project, even if it's a project that's not for your work, so that you can get to those mature parts that you need to have that are in demand. So I would say always be project oriented. Try to do something of a certain level of complexity. Start implementing and don't spend too much time reading. And whatever you
Yeah.
want to use whatever you're most comfortable with. Because there is a certain level of transferable skill between IaC tools. They are different, but conceptually, once you get one down, then it might be easier to learn the target one that you need to learn for your work, or a future one that you need. Sorry.
Awesome. Yeah, you kind of said get your hands dirty and
Mm-hmm.
experiment in the code, and that's the best way to learn. Uh, Potentially with a great course by a great educator such as Andrew Brown.
Thank you.
Awesome. We are finishing our session for today. I want to thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today. And for all our listeners, if you liked the session today, please, follow us and listen to additional sessions. You can follow us in our website, the IaCpodcast.com, or at Twitter at the IaC Podcast, or you can follow me personally at DevOps Ohad. Thank you so much, Andrew. It was a fascinating session with you today. I think a lot of us can learn so much from you. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks. We'll see you soon. Ciao.